He had accidentally trapped an Apache girl. She was afraid he would hurt her. But before we delve into the story, please like the video and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. New Mexico Territory, October 1880. The morning dawned cold and bleak, with no sun yet over the ridge. Frost had settled in the tall grass overnight, turning its edges white. Wade Coulter rose stiffly from his bedroll. The heat from the stove had long since disappeared. He put on his coat, checked the firebox, threw in 2 pine sticks and stirred the coals until a faint glow returned. He moved with a limp. His left leg was stiff at the knee due to an old war wound that had never healed properly. He had grown accustomed to the pain. He had been living alone in the cabin on the high ridge for 3 winters. Since leaving the army after his younger brother Thomas was shot in combat, he had had no desire for orders or men. He took his leave and disappeared north. He built this place near the tree line, half a day's ride from the nearest town, returning only for salt, cartridges, and flour. His life was simple: traps, wood, and work. No one came this far up, and he liked it that way. That morning he stepped out onto the porch and surveyed the ridge. Pine trees stood like sentinels in all directions, black against the gloomy sky. His traps were set along the game trail to the east of the ravine, where coyotes and rabbits moved around at this time of day. He reached for his rifle and strapped on his belt, which held his old cavalry knife. Then he began to walk down the snare trail. His breath came out in short bursts. The air bit hard into his lungs. With every step, the frost crunched under his boots. A few cranes rose from the trees, and then all was quiet again. He didn't expect to catch much, just enough to smoke and hang up for the next few days. But halfway there, near the 5th snare, he stopped. Something was wrong. There was a faint noise behind the bushes. It wasn't a coyote or a squirrel. He approached cautiously. His hand rested lightly on his rifle, but he didn't raise it. He pushed the bushes aside with one arm and looked down. There she was. A woman, an Apache, caught in his trap. She was lying in the dirt, flat on her side with one leg awkwardly stretched out. Her ankle was twisted and bleeding where the snare had closed around it. Her skin was smeared with mud and blood, and she was breathing quickly and shallowly. She looked about 24 years old, or possibly younger. It was hard to tell with all the bruises. Her long, dark hair was matted with dry leaves. Her tight-fitting, low-cut deerskin dress was torn and hanging from one shoulder. One of the front seams had burst open, revealing the curve of her breast and the upper part of her thigh where the fabric was frayed. Her arms were scraped and her feet were bare. Her whole body was shaking, and she was awake and frightened. Her wide-open eyes met Wade's, full of panic. She reached for a stone with her right hand and held it up as if to throw it. It was small and dull. Her grip was weak. It remained still. Stephen didn't speak or raise his rifle. He just stared at her face. Her jaw was clenched and her lips were chapped and dry. Her breath made her chest rise and fall rapidly beneath the torn leather. Wade didn't know her story, but you didn't have to be a genius to see that she hadn't lived freely. Her injuries weren't just from the trap. She had probably been on the run for days, perhaps from bounty hunters or her own people. Some Apache tribes had turned against their own people, branding women as cursed, weak, or unworthy if they failed to obey every law or could not bear children. She was bleeding freely, terrified and caught in his trap. Wade crouched down slowly, keeping his hands low. The last thing he wanted was to scare her further. He pulled out his knife. She screamed. Not loudly. It was more like a breath forced through clenched teeth. He didn't point the blade at her, though. Bending down to the rope, he cut it cleanly and let it fall. The tension eased from her leg. The blood now flowed more freely. She tried to slide back, But her strength left her. She collapsed in the dirt. The stone slipped from her hand. Wade hesitated. He could leave her and let the wolves find her when night fell. She wasn't his problem. But he didn't move. He looked at her ankle. It needed to be cleaned. She wouldn't survive the night. Not with such a deep wound, and not barefoot, not with those bruises on her ribs. He had seen too many corpses and too many graves to add to that number. So he stepped forward. Her eyes widened again. "No," she croaked. Her voice was hoarse and almost broken. She tried to sit up, but cried out and collapsed again. He lifted her up. She resisted weakly. Her fists hit his chest. Her body pressed awkwardly against him, but she couldn't put up much of a fight. She was exhausted, cold and injured. Her skin was warm in some places and ice-cold in others. She was heavier than she looked. Despite her condition, she was strong in the hips and thighs. The torn fabric of her dress brushed against his hands, and he tried not to notice her breast pressing against his coat. He looked ahead, not down. She didn't speak again. She just breathed against his shoulder. She wasn't unconscious, but she had stopped struggling. The way back to the hut was long. His knee hurt, and her body twitched with every step. Once he felt her grab his collar. He didn't know whether it was from pain or desperation. When they reached the hut, he pushed the door open with his shoulder and carried her inside. The warmth hit her hard. She stirred, looking around uncertainly. He laid her gently on the camp bed by the fire and pulled the blanket over her legs. Much of her upper body was still uncovered by her torn dress, but he turned away and kept his eyes on the bandages in the box. He filled a zinc pot with water and placed it near the flames. She watched every move he made. He reached for the cloth and crouched down beside her. "This will burn," he said in a low, flat voice. She didn't answer. He cleaned the wound. She gasped and grabbed the bedpost. He bandaged her ankle with clean linen and checked her toes for warmth. They still had color. That was something. He got up, took the old ladle and poured her a bowl of soup from the pot on the stove. When he set the bowl down beside her, she stared at it as if it might be poisoned. He didn't speak again. He just stepped back, let himself fall into his chair, and watched the flames. The woman didn't touch the bowl for a long time. Then she ate slowly and quietly. Afterwards, she lay down again, still watching him and still trembling. Wade didn't ask who she was or what had happened to her. Neither of them were ready to talk. But he hadn't left her in the trap, and she hadn't tried to escape. Not yet, at least. Maybe that was enough for one day. The woman didn't sleep through the night. Wade heard her moving on the cot as the fire burned down to embers. The blanket rustled occasionally. Her breathing changed rhythmically every hour. Sometimes she sat up, and sometimes she rolled onto her side and moaned softly. He didn't get up or speak. He just lay still on the floor on the other side of the room, wrapped in his own wool blanket, with one boot still on. Keach never slept deeply. When dawn broke, pale through the crack in the shutters, she was already awake, her eyes open and her head turned towards the fire. He sat up slowly, his back stiff from the hard floor beneath him, and leaned forward to throw more wood onto the fire. The flames caught again, casting an orange light across her face and the log walls. Her cheeks were sunburnt, and her skin was dry and thin, but she didn't look unwell, just tired. She said nothing as he went to the stove and filled the tin kettle with water. He turned around briefly. "Do you understand English?" She hesitated, then nodded once, answering a question that had probably been on everyone's lips after watching the previous night. Why hadn't she spoken? It wasn't ignorance. It was a choice. He didn't ask any further questions. He cracked an egg into the pan and dropped 2 slices of dried meat into the fat. The smells spread, warming her, and her eyes twitched slightly. Once, briefly. She was hungry. The night before, he had seen her eating the stew in small bites, as if she hadn't had solid food in days, maybe longer. But she hadn't begged or grabbed. She was proud, even though she was sitting there with her bandaged ankle and her dress torn open across her chest and side. Wade remained on his side of the room. When the food was ready, he divided it between 2 bowls and brought her one. He placed it on the wooden stool next to the camp bed and stepped back without saying anything. She didn't touch it right away. After a moment, she slowly reached for it, as if waiting for him to stop her. He didn't. She ate everything. He watched her silently from the table, turning a single question over in his mind. Where on earth had she come from? The degree was far off the beaten track. There were no cavalry patrols this far inland. There were no traders or townspeople with any reason to be up here. Just deer, snow, and silence. The Apache villages had been driven east months ago. Some had fallen apart, some had been relocated, some had fought back, and some had simply been abandoned. The survivors, mostly women, had formed a band. Wade had once heard rumors in town about a girl who had been exiled by her people because she was marked. No one ever explained what that meant, only that she was cursed, or perhaps she had cursed someone. Looking at her now, he wondered if she was the one. "Name?" he asked. Her eyes met his, not soft or grateful, just alert. "Sana," she said finally, her voice hoarse but firm. That cleared things up a bit. At least he had a name now. She didn't offer hers. The day passed slowly. She tried to sit up after breakfast, wincing when she moved her ankle the wrong way. He took a step closer, so she pulled the blanket tighter around her body, even though her dress was still hanging in tatters around her shoulders. "I need to change the bandage," he said. She didn't argue. Wade laid out clean cloths next to the bed, pulled the blanket back from her leg, and unwrapped the dirty bandage. The wound looked better. It was less swollen. However, the cut was deep, and infection could still set in. As he worked, he kept his hands steady and his gaze fixed on her ankle. However, her torn dress left little to the imagination. The neckline was torn lower than it should have been, and the side slit exposed much of her upper bruised and scraped thigh. She had a strong, powerful body, with broad hips and a soft chest. He saw it. Of course he noticed, but he didn't let his gaze linger. Still, she noticed. When he had finished and stepped back, she looked at him for longer than before. "You're not going to turn me in?" Wade shook his head once. "It's not my business what you did. I didn't do anything. I believe you." She held his gaze for a moment longer, then looked away. Outside, the wind picked up. The pine trees groaned. Snowflakes drifted past the window in waves. In the afternoon, she tried to get up. Wade crossed the room quickly, raising one hand to stop her. "You'll tear it open again." "I can't stay here." "You can't leave either." "I'll be fine." "You weren't fine yesterday," he snapped. He immediately regretted his tone. She froze. Her jaw tightened as if she expected him to lunge at her, but he didn't. Wade stepped back. "You're resting today and tomorrow, and possibly for longer. If you try to walk on that leg, you'll be dead before nightfall." San didn't answer, but she didn't try to get up again either. That night, he gave her another blanket and slept on the floor again. She asked a question into the darkness. "Why are you alone?" He didn't answer for a while. The fire crackled. The wind howled softly around the corners of the hut. "My brother died," he finally replied. "After that, there wasn't much reason to stay." She didn't speak again, but the next morning, she let him help her sit up. She took the stew from his hands without flinching. When he placed her foot on a folded towel to change the bandage, she did not pull away despite the fear that had gripped her on the first night. She began to open up, and for the first time in years, Wade did more than repair traps and cook beans. He watched as the dynamic between them changed. It wasn't wide open, but it was no longer closed. On the fourth morning, the snowfall stopped. The sun broke through, pale and low over the ridge, barely warming the frost covering the windows. Inside the cabin, the air remained dry and heavy with wood smoke. Before sunrise, Wade stoked the fire and poured water into the basin next to the stove. This rhythm was now familiar to him. Wake up, heat, feed, clean. Sana was still asleep when he got up from the floor, but she stirred under the blankets when he moved. Her eyes opened slowly, and for the first time, she didn't flinch when she saw him. She carefully sat up. Her hand instinctively checked the blanket covering her chest, where her torn deerskin was still open underneath. Wade didn't look for long. Instead, he set about making breakfast, cooked oats and meat fried in a pan. For a while, they didn't speak to each other. When she finally sat down against the wall, he handed her the food, as he had done every morning since bringing her in. This time, her hands were steady, and she took it without waiting for permission. "I can help today," she said. He turned to her. "Help with what?" "Wood, dishes, anything." "You don't owe me anything." She frowned. "It's not about debt." He didn't argue. After breakfast, he put on his coat and opened the door to collect some wood. Sana watched him limp outside. The cold air cut through the room. She remained seated and wrapped up in blankets, with her ankle elevated, but her eyes followed his movements through the gap in the shutters. He returned with a bundle of wood, laid it next to the stove, and paused. "Are you sure you want to stand on that leg?" "I can chop wood from the chair. I just need something to do." Wade didn't answer, but he moved the stool closer to the kindling and gave her one of the lighter logs. He propped her leg back on the pillow before helping her to move from the cot to the chair. Her face contorted in pain, but she didn't complain. She tucked the blanket around her waist and shoulders, leaving her arms free. The deerskin top still hung loosely beneath. "Have you ever chopped wood?" Sir asked, glancing at her. "We didn't grow up idle." Her first few blows were clumsy and crooked, and she was too cautious, but her arms were strong and her grip was firm. Wade watched from the corner of the room, letting her figure it out for herself. Then she asked, "What's your name?" He had avoided answering before, not because it was a secret, he just didn't see the point. "Wait," he said. "Wade Coulter." She nodded once and went back to chopping. Later, as the light faded, they sat opposite each other at the table. He had cooked again, beans, salted pork, and thin, bitter coffee. She ate everything on her plate, then looked at him. "Do you still think I'm going to run away?" "No." "Why not?" "You had your chance." She looked at her bandaged ankle. "I couldn't get far." "You could have tried." After that, she didn't speak for a while. He cleared the dishes away. She wiped the table with a cloth. Nobody mentioned how normal everything felt. That night, Wade sat in his usual chair by the fire. Sana lay on the cot with her head propped up on a rolled-up blanket. The light flickered across her face, softening the faint bruises that still lingered on her jaw and temple. She stared into the flames, then asked, "What happened to your brother?" Wade's hand slowed over the coffee pot. He hadn't expected the question. He was 17, too young, but he had volunteered anyway. "I wanted to keep an eye on him," he thought. "I thought I'd bring him home alive. It didn't work out." She didn't ask any more questions. She didn't need to. "I've had enough of cities. Of people, too." Her eyes never left the fire. "They threw me out. They said I was cursed. I was born after a drought.
Then my sister died. Then the crops failed. They said it followed me. Wade didn't speak. It's nonsense, she said flatly, her jaw tight. But if you believe it, it doesn't matter if it's true. He understood. Maybe not in the same way, but close enough. I don't care what you are, he said finally. You're safe here. She nodded once. Her voice was soft when she said, I know. Before going to sleep, Wade brought over a folded shirt, one of his old ones. Wear this tomorrow. Your dress is falling apart. She looked at it. Soft cotton, clean and warm. She didn't say thank you, but she held it as if it were something sacred. He lay down on the floor again. But that night, her breathing was slower and more even. She didn't stir once. In the morning, when he turned towards the fire, he found her already up and sitting near the hearth, his shirt draped loosely over her shoulders. There was no panic on her face, and no fear in her eyes. Just stillness, as if she had always been there. The shirt hung loosely on her. It was Wade's old work shirt, coarse cotton with the sleeves rolled up at the wrists and the shoulders sagging over her frame. It was longer than her dress, falling to her thighs and covering what the torn deerskin could no longer cover. She wore it over the remains of her dress, tying the belt high in the small of her back to keep it tight. It wasn't feminine, but it was safe. Sana moved slowly that morning. The swelling in her ankle had gone down, but she still limped and held onto the edge of the hearth to keep her balance when she stood. Wade watched her without offering help, not out of cruelty, but because they shared an unspoken understanding that she wanted to try on her own. Outside, the wind had died down. The snow on the ridge glistened in the sun for the first time in a week. Wade opened the door and stepped out onto the porch to check the traps again. Sana sat in the chair by the fire waiting and rubbing her ankle. He was gone for almost an hour. When he returned, he had caught 2 rabbits, one of which was almost frozen solid. He placed them on the table and began cleaning them with quiet efficiency. Sana watched him from across the room. There was something about the way he moved. Clean, firm, and precise. Never wasting a cut, and never making a sound unless necessary. She found herself studying his hands more than she intended to. His left wrist bore a deep white scar. "What happened there?" she asked. Wade paused but didn't look up. "Bayonet. Chikama." He continued to skin the rabbit. The smell of iron and fresh meat wafted through the hut. Sana pulled her braid over her shoulder and loosened it with one hand. Her hair was long and thick with mats. He noticed how quickly her fingers moved through it, even as she tried to take the weight off her injured leg. Later, after lunch, she asked if she could go outside for some air. Wade didn't refuse, but followed her out anyway, carrying a blanket in case she got tired. She didn't go far, just to the edge of the clearing where there was a flat stump near the pile of wood. She sat there quietly, pulling the blanket over her lap, and gazed out at the pine trees. "I've never been this far north. I didn't think anyone would come this far. I didn't want to," she said. "I just ran." He said nothing, merely leaning against the post and keeping his eyes on the tree line. After a moment, she asked, "How long have you been alone?" "3 winters." "Why are you staying?" He shrugged. "No reason to leave. But there's no reason to stay, either." He looked at her. Just one glance. Then he nodded. "That's changed now," she said quietly, almost too quiet to hear. Wade didn't answer with words. Instead, he walked over to her, crouched down to check her ankle, unwrapped the bandage, and gently turned her foot. "Keep it clean," he said. She nodded. Her breath caught slightly as his fingers brushed her skin. It was accidental, but not unnoticed. Her legs were bare from the knee down, smooth and chilled by the cold air. His hand lingered a second too long. He pulled it back. She looked at him directly. "You didn't touch me." Vague tension rose. "I didn't think I should." I noticed she didn't smile. She wasn't teasing, she just stated it as a fact. He stood up and moved to retie the bandage. "I've had men treat me like property, as if I were for sale, or cursed, or owed. You don't do that. I don't want anything from you." "I know." The silence stretching between us. It wasn't cold or uncomfortable. It was just real. That night in the cabin, she took the stool back by the fire and watched him boil water for tea. There wasn't much to burn, just pine needles and some old dried leaves, but there was warmth. When he handed her the cup, their fingers brushed. They both paused, the touch lingered. Neither one of them pulled away. When they finally let go, she whispered, "I'm not afraid of you anymore." He sat down slowly and cautiously across from her. "You shouldn't have been from the beginning." She exhaled through her nose. "Maybe not, but I was. I've only ever experienced pain at the hands of men." Wade shifted in his chair and rubbed the scar on his wrist. "You'll never get that from me." "I believe you," she said. Then she added, "That's why I'm still here." As the fire burned low, the cabin fell into its usual silence, but it was different this time. It no longer signified distance. It meant that something was building. As they prepared for the night ahead, neither one of them mentioned the hand they had held between them, but they both felt it. It was the first time that something had passed from one person to another by choice alone, without fear or need.
For two people who hadn't experienced that in a long time, it meant everything. By the middle of the week, the snow had begun to melt in patches under the overhangs at the base of the trees where the sun reached. This was enough to moisten the ground and soften the air. The pine ridge stopped groaning in the wind. Birds returned, and for the first time since Santa's arrival, Wade opened the cabin windows to let the room breathe. She stood barefoot by the stove, his shirt tucked into the waistband of her trousers. Her long, dark hair fell open and was drying after a wash. He noticed how confidently she moved, still not completely healed but no longer limping. The scar on her legs from the noose was still visible, but the skin was no longer inflamed. It had faded to a reddish-pink line. They had fallen into a natural rhythm. The mornings were quiet, with the housework divided without words. She cleaned the basin and swept up the dust. He chopped wood and carried it inside. If he forgot to check something, she had already done it. If she burned the stew, he said nothing and ate it anyway. One afternoon, he returned with a deer from the lower path. She helped him skin it, holding the hide while he cut around the legs and ribs with a blade. Her fingers were stained with blood. She didn't mind. He watched her more now. Not constantly, but often. He noticed the way she stood and the way she adjusted her belt or brushed her hair behind her ear. At night, she still slept on the cot. He still slept on the floor, but the space between them felt smaller. He began to notice the little things, how her shoulder pressed against the wall when she turned in her sleep, how she sometimes murmured half Apache words he couldn't translate. By the 5th day, their supplies were running low. They had barely enough flour, beans, and half a sack of salt. "I have to ride into town tomorrow," Wade announced at dinner. Santa looked up. "How far?" "Half a day, maybe more if the roads are still soft." "You're going alone?" He nodded. "No choice." She hesitated, then asked the question he knew she would ask. "What if they ask?" Wade didn't answer. Not right away, though. He cleaned the knife with slow, deliberate strokes, then laid it next to the plate. "They won't," he said. "They'll wonder." "They're already wondering." She slid down in her seat. Her voice grew quieter. What if someone followed me? What if they know what I am? He looked at her then, really looked at her. He saw a woman in deerskin, half-starved, with dark hair. You might suspect something, but they won't do anything. Sure? No, but I'll handle it. He didn't say how. He promised no more than he could deliver. The next morning, before sunrise, he saddled the mule. He put on his heavy coat, slung his rifle over his shoulder, and tied a sack of dry goods to the saddle pommel. Santa stood at the door of the hut, her arms crossed against the cold. "Stay inside," he told her. "Keep the fire going. I'll be back by nightfall." She didn't argue, but as he turned to leave, she called softly, "Wait!" He stopped. "Don't let them turn you against me." He looked back. They never could. He rode off shortly after sunrise. The town of Valero lay ahead. It was a crooked row of buildings huddled along a muddy road. A church, 2 saloons, a general store, and a post office. Most of the men here remembered Wade, though few knew him well. He kept to himself, buying only what he needed, and rarely talking or drinking. They all knew that he had lost a brother, and that he had returned from the war a changed man. That was enough to stop people asking questions. When he entered the store that afternoon, a few heads turned. "Golter," said Ezra. "I didn't think we'd see you again before spring." Wade nodded. He needed supplies as he was running low. He moved quickly through the aisles, picking up flour, sugar, soap, and more coffee than usual. Flour, sugar, soap, and more coffee than usual. Ezra kept talking, filling the silence. "Still living up there?" "Yeah, it's been bad this year." "Bad enough." Ezra watched him for a long moment. "I've heard some talk. Some men said they saw footprints up there, smaller tracks. We thought you might have company." Wade didn't blink. "Coyotes." "Coyotes don't wear moccasins." Wade placed a can of beans on the counter. Slowly. "I have no one, just traps and trees." Ezra nodded once, but the look remained. Not quite distrust, not quite belief. "Be careful, White. People are getting nervous these days. Indians are disappearing. People are starting to whisper. You'll get caught in the middle." He let the sentence hang. Wade didn't answer. He just paid, saddled the mule, and rode off. He returned to the cabin after dark. The wind was colder again and the sky was full of stars. Light flickered in the window. Santa had kept the fire burning brightly. When he opened the door, she was standing at the stove wearing the shirt with her belt tied tightly around her waist, her bare legs warm in the glow of the fire. "You're late," she said. He closed the door behind him. The road was soft. She studied his face. "Did you say something?" "Nothing worth repeating." Her shoulders relaxed. She took his backpack from him. At night, as they sat silently by the fire, Wade finally broke the silence. "You know someone is with me, or you think so." Santa said nothing. "I told him it was nothing, but it won't stay quiet forever." Looking him straight in the eye, she said, "I don't care what they say." She meant it. She knew he did. Still, she asked, "What if they come?" Wade stared at the fire. His voice rose. "They won't. They'll wish they hadn't." Nothing more was said, but the air between them had changed again. Not because of the danger, but because of the decision he had made. He had chosen her, and made it clear. Not with a kiss or a gesture, but with what he had risked by riding back with the truth still buried. She understood because no one had ever chosen her before. The snow returned the next day, gently at first, then steadily. By nightfall, it had blanketed everything in white again. Roof trees, animal tracks, and even the faint path he had cut with the mule had disappeared by morning. The wind whistled incessantly through the pine trees, but the hut remained warm. Santa had built a roaring fire and was simmering a stew. Her hair was loosely tied back with a strip of deerskin. She moved with confidence now. There was no limping or flinching when Wade approached. The scar on her ankle had healed enough for her to walk barefoot inside. Her toes curled against the rough floorboards. That afternoon, Wade patched the wall near the camp bed and hammered loose boards into place where snow had begun to seep through the cracks. He worked quietly, concentrating. Santa sat nearby, mending one of his shirts by hand. She held the thread carefully as she pierced the thick fabric with the needle. She broke the silence without looking up. "Have you ever been married?" Wade put down the hammer. "No." "Why not?" "I didn't trust the world enough to let anyone in." She nodded as if she understood. "I thought I would get married before the tribe cast me out. I had been promised to a man I didn't love." He looked at her. "Did he treat you badly?" She shrugged. She hadn't had the chance. "When my mother died, everything changed. They said I was a witch. Misfortune followed me. After that, no one wanted to be near me, let alone take me in." Wade didn't answer right away. "You're not a witch." She looked over slowly. "That's what you say now, but you didn't see what they saw." He returned to hammering without a word. Later, when she reached for the ladle to serve him dinner, he placed his hand gently on hers, not grasping, just resting there. Her breath caught. She didn't move. Neither did he. That night, the wind howled louder. It rattled the shutters and tested the doorframe. As he always did, Wade bolted the door, checked the fire, and rolled out his blanket against the far wall by the stove. Sana stood silently on the other side of the room, her arms crossed over her chest. The hem of his old shirt brushed against her thighs. She padded quietly across the floor, passing the cot, and then stopped. He looked up. She said nothing. Instead, she turned around, stepped closer, and knelt down next to his blanket. Wade sat up slowly. "Are you sure?" he asked. She nodded once. "I'm tired of being alone out there." She wasn't trembling with fear or the cold. It was a choice. And for her, it meant everything. He pulled back the blanket. She lay down beside him, her head on his shoulder, and her hand resting gently on his chest. Her skin was warm from the fire. Her body nestled against his in quiet familiarity. There was no urgency, just closeness. He didn't reach for her. He didn't need to. They lay there in silence, breathing together. A few minutes passed. She spoke again. "You still don't want anything from me?" "No," he replied. "Only what you give." She didn't answer, but she stayed. Her legs slid slightly over his, not in an inviting way, but simply due to gravity. Her fingers lightly clawed at the fabric of his shirt. She closed her eyes and waited. He stayed awake a little longer than usual, not out of nervousness, but to listen to the sound of her breathing. He had spent so long not needing anyone that he had almost forgotten what it felt like to want someone around. Not for survival or warmth, but simply because they had chosen to be there. In the past, when he looked at her, he saw what the world had tried to discard. Now, when he looked at her, he saw what she had no right to keep. No one owned her, but tonight she was his because she wanted to be. In a world that had given them nothing but silence, exile, and loss, this moment felt like the first real thing they had ever been allowed to keep. The next morning came slowly and brightly. Snow still clung to the branches outside, but the sky was a clear, pale blue stretching wide and empty across the high desert. Wade woke up first. Sana was curled up beside him, still asleep. One of her hands rested just below his collarbone. He didn't move. He just lay there for a moment longer,
memorizing the warmth between them, the weight of her leg over his, and the slow rhythm of her breathing. It wasn't a dream. When she opened her eyes, she didn't flinch. She didn't pull away either. Her hair was tousled, and her lips were still swollen from sleep. She looked at him for a long moment, as if checking to see if anything had changed. It hadn't. She whispered, "You're not going to act differently now, are you?" Wade shook his head. "No. You?" She gave him the smallest smile he had ever seen from her. "No." They moved slowly that morning. She made coffee. He sat at the table and watched her, not meaning to. Her ankle had almost healed, leaving only a scar and a little stiffness. She moved barefoot. Her shirt still hung loosely over her curves, the sleeves rolled up and the belt tight. Her old deerskin dress, torn and bloody, hung unused behind the door. Neither of them spoke much. They didn't have to. What had changed between them didn't need to be said out loud, but change always attracts attention. It was early afternoon when the knocking came. 3 sharp knocks on the door. Wade froze in mid-step. Sana turned away from the stove. Her body suddenly stiffened. They both looked at the door, as if it might explode. Wade moved first, reaching for the rifle behind the firewood box. He checked the chamber, then stepped to the side of the door, rather than standing in front of it. "Who's there?" he called. After a pause, a soft, calm voice replied, "Sheriff Roland Tate from Valero. I'm looking for a trapper named Coulter." Wade glanced at Sana. Her face had turned pale, and her hands were clenched tightly at her sides. He opened the door to crack. The man outside was older, perhaps in his late 40s, wearing a great coat with a star on his chest and with his gloves tucked into his belt. A horse stood behind him, with a rifle slung over his shoulder. "You're Wade Coulter." "I am." "Mind if I come in?" "Depends on what you want." The sheriff didn't flinch. "No warrant, just some questions." Wade didn't step aside, but he opened the door a little wider. "Make it quick." Sheriff Tate stepped inside. His boots crunched on the threshold as he scanned the cabin. He saw the pot over the fire, the extra tin cup on the table, and the folded blanket by the stove. His gaze lingered on Sana, who stood quietly against the far wall with her arms crossed over her chest and an impassive expression on her face. Was she up here alone? Mostly. "There are rumors. Talk of an Indian woman who has been seen up here. Do you know anything about that?" Wade's jaw worked. What difference would it make? "The difference is, a bounty hunter has come into town to ask questions," says a saloon girl. "She disappeared from a prisoner transport 3 weeks ago and is said to be dangerous." Sana didn't move or speak, but her eyes stared hard at the sheriff. Wade stepped forward slightly. "Does he have a name?" He didn't say, but he did say that she has long hair and a scar on her side, and that she stole from a supply wagon before she escaped. Wade glanced back at Sana. "No one here fits that description," he said flatly. The sheriff eyed him, then her. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure." "You'd be risking a lot by protecting someone like her." "She's not dangerous," Wade said. The sheriff scratched his beard. "Damn it. I don't care who you're involved with, Coulter. My war isn't Belicio. But that man in town is no lawman, and he's not subtle. If he finds out you're hiding her, he might come looking." Wade said nothing. "Do you have a claim on this land?" "Bought it 5 years ago. The deed's in my backpack." "Well, then it's your property. But keep to yourselves for a while. Don't come into town. Don't give people any reason to talk." With that, the sheriff stepped back to the door. Before leaving, he paused and looked at Sana. "Do you have a name?" She replied coolly, "Sana." Have you had any trouble in the past? She met his gaze. Enough, but none of it was my fault. The sheriff nodded briefly. Now, keep warm. Then he left. When the sound of the hoofbeats had faded, Wade closed and locked the door. The cabin was quiet again, but the atmosphere had changed. Sana sat at the table, her hands shaking. He knew it. Maybe, but he's not the problem. The bounty hunter is. He won't find you here. She looked up, her voice sharp. What if he does? Wade didn't answer right away. He crossed the room, knelt before her, and took her hand in his. I won't let him take you. You don't even know what I've done. I don't care. She blinked hard, as if his words had touched something she wasn't ready to face yet.
Then she stood up, stepped closer, and kissed him, not gently or shyly, but truly. When they parted, Wade put his hand on her cheek. You're staying with me, he said. We'll deal with the rest when the time comes. For the first time since the trap, she didn't feel hunted. She felt chosen, not possessed. The next 2 days passed in slow, floating silence. The snow melted just enough to reveal patches of wet earth under the trees. Wade spent most of his time outside, checking the ridgeline, setting new traps, and watching for signs of unfamiliar movement, such as hoofprints, broken branches, and smoke. Sana stayed close to the cabin because she was cooking today. She scraped the inside of the deer hide with a sharpened stone. Her hands moved in long, even strokes. She moved as if she weren't afraid, but Wade knew better. Her eyes always went to the window before she crossed the room. She kept the rifle within reach, even when she pretended not to notice it. That night, she asked him something new. What would you do if he showed up? Wade stoked the fire. Depends on how he comes. If he's armed, I'll shoot first. And if he tries to talk his way in, I won't lie. Back off, I'll finish it. She didn't ask any more questions, but she slept closer to him that night. Her body was curled tightly under his arm, and her breath was steady against his chest. The next morning, disaster struck. Wade saw the trail of dust before the rider came into view. The midday light picked out movement on the lower ridge. A horse. A big man moving slowly and deliberately, not like a lost traveler. Wade closed the shutters, bolted the back door, and loaded both rifles. Sana didn't speak. She tied her hair into a tight braid and slid her knife under the bed frame. The knocking was loud and impolite. Wade opened the door just a crack. The man on the porch looked out of place. He wore a long black coat, clean boots, and a shiny revolver that was too clean for the mountain country. His face was gaunt, his jaw clenched and his mustache thin and sharp. He wore no badge, but he didn't need one. You're Coulter? Who's asking? My name is Handley. I hear you're harboring a runaway. Wade didn't blink. You've been misinformed. Handley smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Apache woman, around 20 years old, with curvy hips and dark hair. She was last seen near Valero. She has something that belongs to me. She's not here. Do you mind if I look for it myself? Yes, I do. He shifted his weight. You're standing in the way of a lawful recovery. You're not the law. She has my property. People aren't property. A moment passed. Then Haley said quietly and slowly, she stole a horse, a saddlebag full of coins, and a rifle. She was a prisoner of war. She escaped custody. Now it's my job to bring her back. Sana's voice rang out behind Wade. You're lying. Wade turned slightly. She was now standing by the stove. She held a gun in her hands, but it was neither raised nor aimed. I didn't steal your damn horse. I ran. You traded me for money and rope, and when your buyer didn't show up, you tried to keep me. Haley's smile faded. You were bought fairly. That makes you mine.
Wade stepped forward. His entire body blocked the door. "She's not going anywhere." His eyes darkened. "You really want this fight?" "I really do." The man didn't flinch. He just nodded once and reached for his pistol. Wade was faster, delivering one clean shot straight to the chest. Haley flew back off the porch and hit the ground with a dull thud. His gun clattered silently across the frost-covered grass. Wade stood there breathing evenly. Smoke rose from the barrel of his gun. Sana stepped outside behind him. They looked down at the body together. She didn't cry or speak. She just crouched down, picked up the pistol, unloaded it with practiced fingers, and threw it into the snow. They buried him at the edge of the clearing, under the pine tree, where the ground sloped steeply away. Wade didn't say a word over the grave. Sana didn't ask him to. By evening, it was as if the man had never been there. Yet everything had changed. She no longer hid. He was not just a man with a quiet cabin. He was someone who had drawn a line in blood. That night, she cooked a meal, sat across from him, and stirred the pot as if it were a normal evening. But the way she looked at him had changed. It was as if the last piece had fallen into place. "You killed for me." "No," replied Wade. "I killed to stop someone from taking what's mine." She put down the ladle, walked over to him, and sat on his lap without asking. She kissed him deeply, slowly, and confidently, not just with desire, but with a sense of belonging. "I'm yours." "I know." They didn't speak for the rest of the night. The fire burned low, and for the first time in their lives, they weren't afraid of what might come next, because they had been through it together and survived. Spring slowly arrived, the last snow melting in streaks down the slope and seeping into the thawing earth. In March, the trees began to bud. The stream behind the cabin flowed louder than before. Birds returned, so did color, so did life. Wade cut new posts for his second room. His hands blistered again, just as they had when he built the cabin for the first time years ago. But he didn't mind. Every board he nailed and every beam he lifted felt like something real and permanent. Most mornings, Sana sat on the porch, wrapped in one of Wade's old coats and with her hands folded over her belly. She was calmer now, not because she was afraid or distant, but because she didn't have to speak to feel seen. She was pregnant. They had known for 2 weeks. She had told him one morning in the quietest possible way. There was no build-up or trembling voice. She simply said, "I think it started." He didn't speak right away. He just placed a firm, warm hand on her waist and nodded. Then he said, "Good." He meant it. The baby was his because of the blood and the timing, because no part of her had ever belonged to anyone else. Not by force, not by trade, and not out of fear. She had given herself to him. They made it theirs. Wade made 2 trips into town that month. He was quiet. He just got supplies. No one asked questions, no one dared. Word of what had happened on the ridge had spread. No one buries a bounty hunter in a mountain grave without reason. The people of Valero weren't eager to find out what that reason was. The next time they crossed paths, Sheriff Tate nodded to Wade. Nothing more, nothing less. Sana never left the pass. She didn't have to. This land had become as much hers as it was his. One morning, she knelt in the dirt in front of the cabin and planted seeds in straight rows, beans, onions, and squash. Her hands were steady and her eyes were fixed on the ground. Wade watched her from the porch, coffee in hand. "Did you ever think we'd end up here?" She didn't look up. "No." He nodded. "Me neither, but I hoped we would," she added. Wade stood up and came down the steps to kneel beside her. She turned to him. Her round belly pressed gently against his side. "You're not cursed. I knew you never were." She rested her head on his shoulder. "It took someone like you to prove it." Later that week, he finished the second room. 4 walls, a door, and clean floorboards. Nothing special. There was just enough room for a cradle and a chest, for her to rest when the time came.
Although he hadn't proposed, and she hadn't asked, one evening she found him sitting at the table carving something out of a piece of wood. "What's that?" she asked. He held it up. "It's a sign." "Just that?" he said. The next morning, he nailed it above the door. After he had hung it up, she kissed him on the porch, then stood with her arms around him, watching the wind blow through the trees. There were no papers, no vows, and no preacher, but she had his name, because she stayed, and so did he. The cabin wasn't quiet anymore. Now it held warmth, laughter, the crackling of the fire, and the creaking of the floorboards. Soon there would be the cries of a child, too. There would be no more running, no more hiding, no more traps. Just a home, built from what the world had thrown away. Brick by brick, breath by breath, hand in hand. They had started out in fear, but ended up with something better. Not just survival or escape, but love and the kind of peace that lasts.